Hello, welcome to Unit 5 of our course. I hope that you enjoyed the Thanksgiving holiday and break. In Unit 5 of our course, which begins on Sunday, December 1st, we will be exploring the conservative movement. The conservative movement was a reaction to the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and it was a reaction to the expansion of liberalism in the 1960s. The conservative movement had many different aspects. The conservative movement was, in part, a defense of traditional values and norms. You learned about the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s in Unit 4 of our course. You saw the film Summer of Love, which discussed the drug culture and sexual experimentation of that era. As you might imagine, many Americans were shocked by the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and many Americans wanted to fight to defend traditional norms and values. Another aspect of the Cultural Revolution was a reaction against the expansion of government that took place in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson played a major role in the expansion of government in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson launched what he called the War on Poverty, after taking office. The War on Poverty included the creation of a number of programs, the Food Stamp Program, Head Start program to provide early childhood education, and also the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. So many conservatives feared that America was moving away from its traditions, its traditional culture, and its tradition of limited government. The first real upsurge in the conservative movement that was seen was the campaign of Barry Goldwater for president in 1964. The campaign of Barry Goldwater really took place before the Cultural Revolution, but it was a response to many Americans feeling that the government had expanded too much. Barry Goldwater campaigned on the platform of limited government. He was a candidate for the Republican Party. And Goldwater essentially argued that American government had expanded too much, that there were too many social welfare programs to aid those in need, and that this was eroding Americans' individualism, the American work ethic. And Barry Goldwater basically argued that the government was the problem and that we need less government. He argued for an end to the war on poverty and for a reliance on essentially free market capitalism. So in the 1964 campaign, you saw certainly an emphasis on, from the conservative movement and Barry Goldwater, on reducing government and cutting taxes. And that's certainly one of the main pegs of the conservative movement that first emerges in the 60s, is an argument for lower taxes and an argument for less, especially social spending, less spending on social programs, generally designed to aid those, the working class or the working poor. So that was one aspect of the conservative movement. Barry Goldwater did not win the election of 1964, so the conservative movement's first major campaign for national office was a failure. However, in the 1960s, you do see the election of Ronald Reagan as governor of California, and Ronald Reagan would become the leader of the conservative movement, certainly by the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And unlike Barry Goldwater, ultimately Ronald Reagan would be successful in winning the presidency. Another aspect of the conservative movement that I alluded to was a reaction against cultural changes. The conservative movement was not just focused on limiting government. Many Americans grew increasingly concerned about what they perceived as an erosion of morality in American culture. There was a concern that with the rise of the drug culture and the sexual revolution and the rise in divorce rates, that American culture was spinning out of control. This feeling was especially strong amongst older Americans. If you look at the conservative movement, its largest base of support came from individuals who were older than the baby boom generation, individuals in their 60s, 70s. The older generation was the strongest base of support for the conservative movement, although there certainly were younger Americans who were part of the conservative movement as well. One strong element of support for the conservative movement were evangelical Christians. Evangelical Christians particularly strong in the American South, but certainly had a basis of support all through the United States. Many Christians and Christian denominations were concerned about what they perceived as an erosion of morality. And you see the emergence of televangelists like Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell was a prominent minister who had a television program in the 1970s and 1980s, and he began to rally opposition to these sorts of cultural changes and shifts that had taken place. He solicited contributions, and ultimately Jerry Falwell created a political organization called the Moral Majority. And the Moral Majority was committed to providing financial support to candidates who basically defended traditional values. By that, Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority meant values such as defending the presence of religion in American life. Some Christians felt that there had been too many restrictions placed on religious observance in public. In the 1960s, there were court rulings which ruled that there couldn't be school-led prayers in public schools. Prior to the 1960s, in many public schools, there was prayer and study of the Bible in school. This seems perhaps strange to us today, but if you went to school in the 1950s or even the early 1960s, and certainly before that, there were prayers at the beginning of the school day. There were prayers at the end of the school day, and there was open study of the Bible as well. Generally, a Protestant religion was taught in public schools. Well, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of freedom of religion, the free exercise of religion, and ruled that there could be no, school-supported prayer in public schools. This didn't prohibit individual students from praying on their own, but it prohibited school-led prayer. Many conservative Christians felt that this was an attack on their morality, an attack on their religion. Many evangelical Protestants felt this way. Also, there was a concern with what many evangelical Christians regarded as an increasingly profane culture. In the 1960s, the censorship of film and television really came to an end. And increasingly in films and movies, you saw more and more sexuality, more and more profane language, depictions of drug abuse. Also, there were Supreme Court rulings in the 1960s which affected this. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court, for the first time, ruled that pornography was a form of protected speech. That pornography was protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution as a form of speech, and therefore pornographic materials could be published and sold. So from an evangelical Christian's perspective, these rulings were viewed as sort of perverse. So the Supreme Court is ruling against prayer in schools, and the Supreme Court is ruling in favor of pornography. This was seen by many evangelical Christians as an attack on mainstream values and norms. There were other issues as well. One of the big issues that emerged was the Roe v. Wade decision. In the early 1970s, the United States Supreme Court struck down most state laws which restricted abortion rights, access to abortion. And as a result, abortion became abortion services became much more readily available to American women across the nation. And some evangelical Christian groups rejected this. The Roman Catholic Church also objected to this. And this became part of the conservative movement, a campaign to try to restore some sort of restrictions on access to abortion. This became known as the pro-life movement. Of course, even the terminology of this is disputed. It was referred to as the anti-abortion movement by some, the pro-life movement by others. So what you see in the rising conservative movement is a concern with a variety of different sort of moral or cultural issues. Some of them surrounding sexuality, some issues surrounding profanity in public media, and other concerns. Part of the rise of the conservative movement was a desire to restrict the drug culture, to launch a war against drugs, to try to reduce access of drugs in America, partly in response to the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and early 70s. So there are a whole host of issues that emerged. Another issue that emerged in the conservative movement was a concern with the growing outward expression of homosexuality. In the late 1960s and in the 1970s, there emerged a gay rights movement in the United States. And many conservatives, and certainly many evangelical Christians, rejected this gay rights movement and argued that homosexuality is a sin. So that became an aspect of the conservative movement as well, an opposition to the gay rights movement, or the movement for equality for gay men and women. So all of these forces combine to create the conservative movement. So just to review those briefly, an objection to the growth of government, a desire to cut taxes, and a desire to return to traditional norms and values rooted in evangelical Christianity. In this unit, you'll be asked to participate in 2 discussion boards, as usual. The discussion board posts, one deals with the rise of the conservative movement. The second discussion board post addresses the end of the Cold War, which also took place in this era, in the late 1980s. You see the beginning of the end of the Cold War. You will be asked to read 2 documents, both of which deal with the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was first created in the 1920s, and it was an amendment which would prohibit any discrimination on the basis of sex. So there was an effort to amend the Constitution to make it unconstitutional to discriminate against Americans on the basis of sex. Clearly, the emphasis was to end discrimination against women in particular. The Equal Rights Amendment was reintroduced in the 1970s, and it became a major issue of public debate. Conservative groups argued against the Equal Rights Amendment, and generally conservative groups opposed the feminist movement. There was Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative woman, was the most outspoken opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment. You will read a document that she wrote in opposition to the ERA. You'll be asked to comment on these 2 documents about the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment never was ratified. It never became law. You will also be asked to watch a film on Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a champion of the conservative movement and was ultimately elected president and did much to advance the conservative agenda. I hope that you'll find this unit to be interesting and engaging. I look forward to working with you during this unit. I suspect that at least for many of you, these events will become more familiar as we reach more towards the present. So some of you may have lived through the 1980s and may remember, aspects of the conservative movement. And I hope you'll share your thoughts and experiences as you have throughout the course. I really do look forward to working with you, engaging with you on the discussion boards. And again, I hope that you'll find this 5th unit of the course to be engaging. Thank you.